Crikey, that's a bit of a build-up. It's going to be a massive disappointment now, isn't it? Right, thank you. Hi, it's lovely to be up here in Halton. Yes, I'm a scientist, so this is your dose of science for the day. Sorry, guys. But the reason why I do the work I do is really to provide the evidence as to why we have to actually support fathers and have father-inclusive practice. Because without the evidence to show, for example, that men are instinctive parents, that men are as equally biologically prepared to parent as mums are, that men go through a profound psychological change when they become fathers, that they build amazing and crucially different bonds to their children than mothers do, that they have their very own role in child development. Without all this evidence, it's harder, particularly to convince some people in certain sectors of society that actually we need to support fathers. So this is your evidential talk. I'm just going to go through very briefly what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the evolution of human fathers, so when they evolved, but also why they evolved. Who dad actually is. So what do we mean when we talk about a father? We're going to go through the biological changes that men undergo when they become fathers for the first time, and that's mainly focused on hormonal changes and brain changes, so exactly the same as women. The psychological changes they go through, so looking at the transitions and the very profound changes in identity that occur, and also their mental health. I know we've got other talks here today, particularly I think from Mark, who is obviously incredibly famous for his mental health work. He's going to talk a lot about that, but I'm just going to briefly mention mental health in fathers. We're going to look at what dads actually do. Because for a very long time, certainly when I started studying fathers 20 years ago, they were seen to be dispensable, which obviously is complete rubbish, but actually what do dads do? What do they uniquely bring to the family? We're going to look at how they build their role, how they build their bonds, particularly to their children. And we're going to look at their role in child development, which is a really exciting and constantly evolving area of study now, because the more we study it, the more we find that they have an absolute unique role, very, very separate to mum, which is absolutely fundamental actually to the functioning of our society. So we're going to look at how they have a role in baby development, in child development, and quite crucially actually in their adolescence development. But I want to talk just very, very briefly about the evolution of human fathers, because we have this myth, and I'm afraid some of the dads I work with still believe this, which is that mothers are instinctive parents. They're out the baby pops, and mothers know exactly what to do with it. And fathers have to learn it. And this is based very much on the idea that mums are like, they're evolved to care, they're biologically primed to care, they know instinctively what to do. Whereas fathers, because they're at that disconnect, particularly from pregnancy, that they actually have to learn. It's a steep learning curve for them. And there's absolutely no instinct in there at all. Now, I'm an evolutionary anthropologist. I always start from the first principles of evolution, and I can tell you this, that human fathers are really, really rare. Okay, in the mammalian line, there are only 5% of mammals have investing fathers, and we are the only ape that has an investing father. So for something so incredibly rare to evolve, for it to go through the amazing biological, psychological, sociological changes that occurs in evolving something that rare in the mammalian line, he has to do something. Evolution doesn't cause things to evolve if they're not needed. So dads had to evolve for a reason. And they've actually been around for 500,000 years. So investing fatherhood in the human line evolved about 500,000 years ago, long before we evolved. And it was mainly because of the fact that, as you all know, human babies are incredibly dependent. They're incredibly dependent because they're actually born far too early. They should probably be in there for at least another 9 months, if not well over a year. And that's because we've got enormous brains. Our brains are 6 times bigger than they should be for a mammal of our size. And we also walk on 2 legs, so we've got a very narrowed birth canal. And therefore, to enable that big brain to get through that narrow birth canal, we birth our babies very, very early. Now, this actually evolved about 1.8 million years ago. And for the first just about million years, women coped by turning to their female kin to help them raise these children, and that was absolutely fine. But about 500,000 years ago, our brains took another massive increase in size, and suddenly women couldn't do it just on their own. At that point, the next genetically related person stepped in, and that was Dad. And he's been doing it ever since. For 500,000 years, he's been stepping in, and he has particular roles, particularly in relation to toddlers and in relation to adolescents, in terms of actually taking them off mum's hands, essentially enabling her to, for example, have another baby. This was long before contraception, obviously. So human fathers are rare. Keep that in your mind, and therefore they have to have had some advantages. So we can conclude 2 things from this. First of all, evolution doesn't leave things to chance. It's not going to cause something as rare as a human father to evolve without giving him a little bit of a leg up in some way. And that leg up is the biological and the psychological changes we're going to look at to enable him to have the best chance possible to do a good job. Secondly, he hates redundancy evolution. Don't know why I suddenly become a bloke. Let's say she hates redundancy. And the reason for this is she doesn't cause something to evolve twice. So we don't need a male mother. Dads are not male mothers. They have a very special and very unique role which complements that of the mother. And therefore, I'm going to talk a lot about how dad is different to mum and why that difference is actually critical to child development and it's critical to the way we raise our children. I just want to focus a little bit on who dad actually is. I study fatherhood around the world, so not just here in the West. And we've got a little bit of an obsession with biological fathers here in the West, that's the real dad. And I even hear people talking about that, using that term quite a lot. Actually, if you look around the world, that obsession with biological fatherhood is quite unusual. Because actually, a dad is not somebody who's related due to conception, due to a role in conception. It's whoever steps up and does the job. And these we call social fathers. And in a lot of societies, social fathers are actually the real dads. And it's for cultural reasons, for hereditary reasons, for reasons to do with economics. For example, the biological dad might have to go away and work a long way from the children, and therefore a social dad steps in. And that social dad could be a grandfather, an uncle, an elder brother, a friend, a teacher. In some societies, children have whole teams of dads. And those dads will step in and step out at different times to support that child. So when I talk about fathers today, I'm not just talking about biological dad. We've already heard from Adam about being a stepfather. I'm talking about all fathers. I'm talking about stepfathers, adoptive fathers, social fathers, grandfathers, uncles, whoever actually steps up and does the job. That is who gets to get the label of being the dad. So first of all, dads are as biologically prepared to parent as mums are. So evolution has caused fathers to go through these profound changes when they become a father for the first time to enable them to do a good job. So first we're going to look at the hormonal changes, and you might have heard of this one. This is one of the first discoveries that was made, and that is when a man becomes a dad for the first time, his testosterone drops by up to a third, and it will never return to pre-birth levels as long as he remains in some form of contact with that child. So even if you are a divorced father, as long as you remain in contact or you don't cohabit with the mother of your child or partner, you will still experience this drop in testosterone. And why is it important that this happens? Well, testosterone, as I'm sure you all know, it's a great chemical, but it's actually there to make a man find a mate. And it's important, high levels of testosterone motivate the man to find a mate, and they also make him more attractive to the opposite sex. However, if you then want to commit and you want him to focus on the family, that testosterone is not terribly helpful, because it means that actually his brain is driving him to always just scan the horizon to see if there's anything better going on, and we don't really want that to happen. So what we do is we drop the testosterone. Nobody understands what the mechanism is that causes this to happen necessarily, but it happens in all birds and reptiles and mammals that have investing fathers, and unsurprisingly, it also happens in human males. Now, the advantage for this is twofold. We know that men generally with lower testosterone are more empathetic, and they're more motivated to care. So by dropping that testosterone, we're priming that man to get these empathetic skills, to be motivated to care for that child. Secondly, high levels of testosterone actually are not terribly helpful if you want to form a bond, because they actually block some of the effects of particularly dopamine and oxytocin, which are two of the very important bonding chemicals. So by dropping this testosterone, we're not only motivating this man, increasing his ability to empathise, but we're also releasing these wonderful chemicals, so that when he interacts with his child, he gets a good hit of oxytocin and dopamine that helps him to bond to that child. So that drop in testosterone is really, really critical. But that's not the only one that goes through a change. This is more recent research. So first of all, oxytocin increases to cement bonds with the partner and the baby. Now this starts if you live with the pregnant partner. This will begin in pregnancy, and it continues to a good 6 months after the birth of the child. And obviously oxytocin is one of the key bonding hormones, and it's important at this point to really cement the two key bonds in your life, that's your partner and that's your baby. Particularly during a very stressful time, a difficult time maybe, it's important that that bond is as strong as it possibly can be. Vasopressin, which is a little bit like oxytocin, slightly different, increases to increase attention and motivation. So in non-human mammals, vasopressin is seen as male oxytocin. It's not quite like that, but it's actually used for defense of the nest in non-human mammals. But in us, it appears to be something to do with it increasing attention to the child and increasing the motivation to care for the child. Believe it or not, cortisol levels decrease, which is always a bit shocking, because let's face it, it's quite stressful. But actually, cortisol levels decrease. That's important as well, because high levels of cortisol, again, block the impact of rewarding and bonding hormones. So we need to drop those so that you have that opportunity to have as many hormones, wonderful positive hormones, flooding your system as possible. But reactive cortisol response times increase. And reactive cortisol is that spike in cortisol when something immediately stressful happens. Okay, so suddenly a tiger is running towards you. You get a peak in cortisol to hopefully help you run. So whilst general background cortisol will reduce, which is helpful, we've still got a dad who can respond very, very quickly to a threat to his child. And finally, a lovely little chemical called prolactin, which in women is involved in breastfeeding. In other investing father mammals, is involved actually in carrying the young. It does increase in humans, but what it seems to be in humans is it promotes positive thoughts regarding fatherhood and increases motivation to care. So rather than having more negative thoughts about fatherhood, like I'm stressed, I'm frustrated, I'm not enjoying this, whatever, it's there to actually try and boost those positive thoughts about your child and your new identity. So there's a whole tidal wave of hormone changes that occur when a man becomes a father. He is not there on that steep learning curve that we think he is. He's actually just as primed to be a parent as the mother is. So they're both instinctive, and obviously they both have a very steep learning curve as well in terms of learning how to care for their child, learning who their child is, etc. Secondly, we see a lot of changes in the brain in men when they become fathers for the first time. And again, this was something which we knew happened in women. We've known it happens in women for about a decade. But it was only reasonably recently that it was discovered that it also happens, unsurprisingly, in men. So first of all, we see activation of the global human parental caregiving network. This is a network that involves both the cortical areas of the brain, so that's the wrinkly bit on the outside, things like attention and planning and empathy and problem solving. But it also is in the core of the brain, within the reward systems. So that's dopamine, which enables you to have a reward for doing this very difficult thing of parenting. But also in areas linked to nurture, and in the amygdala, which is associated with detecting risk. So we see this global parenting network suddenly light up in the male brain. Secondly, we see increases in grey matter in areas of the brain associated with parenting. So grey matter is the neurons, and obviously the denser your grey matter, the more cognitively efficient you are at doing a particular job. So we see it in the amygdala and hypothalamus. Both of those are involved in attention and in risk detection and in the response to risk. The hypothalamus is what produces cortisol. We see increases in grey matter in the prefrontal cortex. That's the bit just behind your forehead. And that's where all your social cognition is. And so we see linked to empathy, attention, and planning, all really key parental roles. We see increases in grey matter in the cortical areas linked to social cognition, motivation, and reward. So this is a new relationship in your life, and it's probably a very different relationship to any you've ever had before. You need to have really good primed social cognition to be able to learn how to interact with your baby, learn the character of your baby, start subsuming that relationship into your own identity, so building that identity of being a dad. You also need to be motivated to care for the child, and you get rewarded for it as well in terms of neurochemistry. But interestingly in men, and we don't see this in women, we also see deactivations and decreases in grey matter. So we see neuronal pruning, and that happens in the brain when a bit of the brain isn't really very important. So ever efficient, your brain will prune some of the neurons in your brain if they're not helpful. And this is linked to stress, ambiguity. I don't know why I've put stress twice, obviously very stressed. Linked to stress and ambiguity. So again, we're going to try and reduce those stress levels or your reaction to stress. And we're also going to try and take away ambiguity in your environment. So ambiguity in your environment, things that are going to distract you, things that are going to confuse you, because all we really want you to do is focus on this baby. So whatever else is going on around here, we'd like you to focus on the baby. And by pruning those neurons, it gives you that focus to be able to care. Now, what's really interesting is obviously these changes mirror to a certain extent, apart from the deactivations and the decrease in grey matter, what happens in a mum's brain. But what about the actually activations in the brain? So we're not talking about the actual structure of the brain, we're talking about what happens when a parent interacts with their child. And what we see in parents is, interestingly, synchrony in some areas, and then we also see asynchrony in others. So synchrony, so if we ask a parent to interact with their child whilst they're in an fMRI scanner, regardless of whether they're a mum or a dad, we will see areas of the brain associated with empathy, for example, lighting up to the same levels of intensity. So dads are as empathetic as mums. However, we actually see differences in the peak activations in the brain, depending on whether you're a man or a woman. If you're a mum, and this is partly to do with the fact that motherhood is incredibly evolutionary ancient, what we see if you're a mum is we see, if you look at that left-hand side, you'll see a yellow-orange spot right at the bottom. That is the very core of the brain. That's the limbic area of the brain. It's very, very ancient. It's associated with nurture and risk detection. So the peak in activation for a mother is in relation to nurturing and risk detection. But when we look at the peak in activation for a man, it's actually on the outer area of the brain. That's again slightly reflecting the fact that evolutionarily, investing fatherhood is much younger. But it also shows the different role of a father. And that's in relation to, and we'll go back and back and back to this during this talk, the fact that he is actually the guy who is going to underpin that child's entry into the world beyond the family. So the areas of his brain associated with social cognition, with planning and problem solving, are where the peak activation is, because he's the guy who's actually going to say to his child, right, now you have to go out into the world and you have to survive, and I'm going to be the parent to give you the skills to do that and give you the resilience to do that, and we'll talk about more of that. But we see that role in the actual activations of the brain. It's not to say that dads don't nurture. Obviously, they do have an activation in the core, and that mums don't have cognitive activations, but they're not the peak ones. So the question arises, what if you are a single parent or you're gay? I, studying fathers, have studied gay fathers. And actually what happens is absolutely fascinating, because what we see in the primary caretaking gay father is actually both areas of the brain have peak activations. So the human brain is amazing. It's very, very plastic. It's very, very open to change. And because this father is actually taking on that nurturing risk detection role, which is usually the maternal role, but he's also still a dad, actually both areas of the brain have peak activation. So we see what we'd call the mum's peak activation, but we also see the dad's peak activation. And even more fascinating for those of us who get excited about these things is there's a new neuronal connection between the two. So those two different sides to his role as the primary caretaking father actually talk to each other so that he can do this very smooth role in terms of actually being the one who nurtures, who risk detects, but also who scaffolds the child's entry into the social world. So that's probably also, by the way, what happens if you are a single father. And you don't have contact with the mother, that's probably also what happens, but unfortunately, I haven't actually got to that study quite yet. So the big question is, what causes these biological changes? So I spoke about who a dad actually is, and the wonderful thing about human fatherhood is its flexibility. And this flexibility extends to the fact that these biological changes are not caused by being genetically related to the child, being the biological father of the child. They're caused by the fact you've interacted with the child. So these changes occur after the child is born, and we see quite drastic changes in the male brain in the first 6 weeks after the child is born. And therefore, any man can step up and be a father, and he will be given the evolutionary, step up, head start that enables him to do the job. Because obviously mums do have a bit of a head start if you've gone through pregnancy, if you're a biological mother. Lovely, loads of hormones. The brain changes that occur in mothers generally occur before and after birth. But with dads, because it's all after birth, it means that any man can step up. So if you're a stepfather and you're hands-on to your stepchildren, these biological changes will occur. If you're an adoptive father, if you are a social father, they will occur. All you have to be is in interaction with that child. So what are the psychological changes that occur? We call this a transition. So when you have a change in identity, it's a transition. And for fathers, the change from being, a non-father to a father is a profound transition in someone's life. But I think it's something that we actually don't really talk enough about in our society. Actually, in many societies, it is something that's recognised. So I've studied societies around the world in different areas, and they actually have rituals to welcome the man into the world of fatherhood. So there will be rituals where he's presented to the community and he asks the community for support. There'll be rituals where he, in the same way that a mother might go into some form of solitude before she gives birth, a man will also go into solitude before he becomes a father. So there are all these rituals which acknowledge that this man is actually going through something incredibly profound in his life. Unfortunately, here in the West, we don't really do that. We have the wonderful baby shower, but they tend to be rather female focused. So one of the things I do argue actually is one of the reasons why We have quite high rates of poor mental health in fathers in this country, and in some areas there really aren't. It's because we don't do that acknowledgement. We don't ask the community for help. We don't provide the support net. We don't acknowledge that this father is going to need help during this profound change. And that's probably one of the reasons why we have higher rates of paternal mental health issues than in some countries. So the transition to fatherhood can take up to 2 years. Now in mums, it's around 9 months before a mum will actually sort of step forward and go, okay, yeah, I've adopted this new identity. I now don't, get completely freaked when someone explains to me that I'm the mother of a child, and I feel competent in doing this. For fathers, it takes 2 years on average. It's less if you are the primary caretaking father, because you achieve competency much quicker. But if you are a father who has to go out to work, you have less time to achieve competency, you have less time to build the bond with your child, and therefore it's going to take you longer. And that's something we need to recognise, that fathers actually need quite profound support for a good period of time after a child is born. What are the things that are the factors in that transition? First of all, identity. So how has he decided what kind of dad he's going to be? Because in one sense, the wonderful thing about being a father is actually it's quite a flexible role. It's what we call a facultative role. It's less tied to biology than the mum's role is. So as a father, you kind of have more scope to decide what kind of father you want to be. However, this can lead to challenges in its own right. So first of all, who were your role models? What does your culture tell you a father is? And social ideas about fatherhood are one of the biggest impacts on how fathers adopt an identity in a society. It's incredibly and quite often constricting, as in, this is what we think a father should be, sit in your box. That's where you sit. And in our society for many, many years, and still today in many places, particularly in some workplaces, that's you're the breadwinner. You're not the nurturer, you don't care, you don't get up in the middle of the night, and you certainly don't deserve flexible working times, because that's what you do. So your cultural ideas about what a father is are very powerful, but also who were your personal role models? Did you have a father in your life as a young man? Was it a positive role model? Was it a negative role model? Is it a role model that you're going to act against? Do you feel a bit lost because you didn't have a role model? You're not quite sure what to do or how to fulfill this role? Or are you looking to maybe teachers you had as a child as the sort of character you want to be? Or even people in the media as to what sort of father you want to be? Fathers who transition successfully do it much more successfully if they can have a defined role, if they think during pregnancy, what kind of dad do I want to be? And it's for all of us to help fathers find that defined role. So it's about conversations during pregnancy. It's about the realities of life, the practicalities of life. Unfortunately, quite often in these days, I find with my dads, there's quite a big gap, actually, unfortunately, between what they want to do and what they can actually do. And that's mainly confined by culture. But what kind of dad do they want to be? Competency. So the more competent you feel, the quicker you will transition. And that is why primary caretaking fathers tend to transition much quicker, because they reach competency much, much quicker. The degree of support from the professionals. This is one of the biggest factors in how well men transition, is what support do they get from social and healthcare workers? It's getting better, but I still am afraid hear the most horrific stories about the lack of support for fathers from social and healthcare workers. It's getting better. There are some amazing groups now, and I've been doing this for 20 years, and it's certainly improved, but it's really critical to dads as to how they are treated and accepted into that as a team who are having a child. And a really big one is paternity leave. We know where men take extended paternity leave, not just the 2 weeks, both in this country and abroad, they transition much, much quicker. And that's all because they reach competency quicker, obviously, and they have more time to build the bond with their child before they go back to work. Paternity leave is an incredibly powerful tool, and it's something that obviously we have to continue to fight for so that we actually have adequate, workable paternity leave in this country. The parenting relationship. Now, this is actually reasonably unique to fathers as compared to mothers. Fathers view the family structure in a very different way to mothers do. Mothers tend to view the family structure as a series of dyads, so as a series of couples. So if you've got parents and a baby, it'll be the relationship between the parents, between the mum and the baby, and between the dad and the baby. And as far as the mum's concerned, they all sit in little isolated pods. And if something happens in one of them, in terms of conflict, it does not bleed over into the others. So she can be having the most humdinger of an argument with her partner, but she's still, the relationship, the bond with her baby is fine. Dads, it's very different. Dads view families as a triad if we've got 3 of them. And so what happens in one relationship bleeds into another relationship. So if he's having a tough time with his partner, that will impact the relationship he has with his child. So the parenting relationship is one of the biggest predictors of how well a father will transition, a man will transition into fatherhood. I spend a lot of time trying to convince antenatal providers to spend time focusing on shoring up the parenting relationship, making the parenting relationship healthy before the baby is born, because that in particular helps fathers transition comfortably, and it reduces the risk of poor mental health. But it's kind of a bit of an uphill battle at the moment. So parenting relationship particularly key for fathers. Obviously, paternal mental health. If you're suffering from poor mental health, that transition is going to be much, much harder for you to deal with. I certainly, when meet my dads, particularly in the early weeks after birth, when their mental health is a bit up and down, certainly I hear a lot of my baby doesn't like me, or I'm not doing a very good job as a dad, or I'm not doing as well as my partner. A lot of viewing mum as the gold standard. And so again, we have to support fathers, particularly in those early weeks, in relation to their mental health and how they're identifying as a father. And the last one is the attachment to the child. We're going to talk more about attachment and bonding in a minute, but one of the big ones also is, how does the father feel the bond is going with his child? How does he feel it's developing? Does he feel it's secure? Is he anxious about it in any way? And that again is predictive of how quickly he transitions. The more secure the attachment between child and parent, the quicker the father will transition to being fully identified as a father, and that transition will be a happy and healthy one. I'm going to talk very quickly about male perinatal depression, because I know we've got much more of an expert here than me on this. But 10% of fathers experience postnatal or perinatal depression. Risk factors for fathers, which are different to mothers, include a relationship with partner. There it is again. That's one of the absolute biggest ones, is how good is the relationship with the partner. Treatment by healthcare workers. There it is again. The gap between expectation and reality. This is a really big one, because we have a lot of noise now about involved fatherhood, and which is wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. I'm so glad we're at that point where dads, this generation of dads in particular, are coming forward and going, yes, I want to be involved. I want to be hands-on. I know now who I am. I know, they know a lot of this knowledge now, and I'm motivated because I know how important I am to my child. And that's wonderful. And I quite often, during pregnancy, I'll do interviews with the fathers, and they'll have all these amazing plans and all this amazing idea about who they're going to be to their child and what they're going to do, what they're going to think is important. And then we go back and they've gone back to work. And unfortunately, it's hard to live up to the idea of who they wanted to be, because they don't have the time, they don't have the support. And that gap can be really difficult to deal with, and that can increase the likelihood of having poor mental health. Partly because they don't feel as competent as they thought they were going to, because they haven't had the time. And that work-life balance. Some workplaces are getting better, particularly workplaces which are actually supporting shared parental leave with financial support. That's wonderful. But quite often I have stories of men going back to work. The baby will be mentioned for maybe the first half a day, and then nobody mentions it again. It's not really seen to talk about your children. It's certainly not seen to take time off or ask for flexible working. Quite a lot of dads still get the reaction when they go back to work of, well, it's not really a time in your life when you should really be focusing on your family. If you want to climb the ladder, this is the time you should be focusing on work. Or, men don't do caring and, man up, basically. And unfortunately, we still have workplaces that are like that. So for fathers, that can be very challenging, because what they wanted to be as a father isn't necessarily what they can be. And that's really quite hard to deal with. Obviously, a partner suffering from perinatal depression, they are comorbid. So if your partner is suffering, you are more likely to. Previous poor mental health. So fathers who have in the past had poor mental health are more likely to suffer. Traumatic birth. This is, it kind of shocks me how long it's taken for traumatic birth for men to come onto the radar. I know for women it's only coming onto the radar now. But traumatic birth is one of the biggest predictors of poor mental health in men. Men generally are not focused on after a traumatic birth. It's actually the reason why I started studying fathers. I had a traumatic birth, but I passed out, and morphine is a wonderful drug. But my husband saw it all, And he was deeply traumatised and had PTSD as a result, but he was offered absolutely no support for that at all, while I was offered counselling. And that's still very much the case. We welcome men into the birthing room, and women want men in the birthing room, but at the same time, we don't provide them the support of their experience of being in the birthing room. And sometimes it can literally be akin to watching a car crash, going in slow motion with two of the people you love most in the world at risk. So we need to be much more supportive of men who've experienced traumatic birth. The one thing I will say, I'm not going to focus on PTSD today because that's a different talk. Let men define what is traumatic. Okay? It is very subjective what is traumatic. I learnt this very early on in my practice. I always go and see the dads when their baby's 2 weeks old, and I say to them, how was the birth? I'm quite often the first person to ask them that question, and they will tell me. And I went to see one guy who, on paper, had a beautiful birth. Water birth, very quick, everybody very happy. He was in the pool, she was in the pool, baby was marvellous. She didn't want any pain relief. He was deeply traumatised because he was the kind of guy who liked to be in control. And he also felt he was very much the rock. And he could not cope with the fact his wife was in pain, she wouldn't take anything, and he couldn't take the pain away. And that was what traumatised him. And he was traumatised. I went to see another guy the week after who had a really difficult birth. His partner had hemorrhaged, baby had got stuck, she had to have an emergency cesarean. He was handed the baby, then left in a room on his own for 3 hours while they fought to save his partner's life. Standing there with a baby, nobody told him when anything was going on. But he was fine. And he was fine because he had a different viewpoint. His was, I'm in the right place. It's awful that this has happened, but I'm in the right place and they're going to do their best. And it's going to be okay. So I learned very early on, you have to let the father decide what is traumatic, not you. So just briefly, just be aware the symptomology of postnatal depression in men is very different to that in women. It tends not actually to be necessarily depression. It tends to be more an increase in anxiety and aggression, feelings of aggression and frustration. What we see in terms of behaviour is we either see increased intrusion. So when the father is interacting with the baby, it's actually quite intrusive interaction. It's not an interaction which flows from the baby being led by the baby. It's more very, very intrusive with quite a lot of negative language and negativity when interacting. Or they will detach from the baby and the family. We tend to see a lot of self-medication in fathers who have perinatal depression. So a lot of the use of drugs and a lot of use of drink to try and cope. So what are the interventions? Prevention is really important. So preparation of the parenting relationship. This is a really big one. Again, if we can get this into antenatal courses, that would be marvellous. Because if we can shore up that relationship, if we can give the parents tools to deal with the inevitable conflicts that are going to occur after the birth of a baby, then we can help them maintain that relationship and it will affect the men less. Identification of attachment issues prenatally. There are now some wonderful instruments that we can use to work out whether somebody's going to suffer or find it difficult to attach to the baby, and we can do that prenatally. So we can identify those men who are at risk from that. We can have discussions around identity about what kind of dad do you want to be, and is that realistic in the world that you live in, and handling those expectations. Identifying the support network and trying to find as much paternity leave as we can. We ask dads to try and find a role early on. That's quite difficult because particularly if your partner's breastfeeding, as we all know, very newborn babies, eat, sleep, poo, eat, sleep, poo, and they spend a lot of time breastfeeding. And it can be really hard. Men can feel quite excluded. Whilst breastfeeding is a wonderful thing, it can actually be quite excluding for men, I'm afraid, in some circumstances. So what we need to do is help dad find a role early on. What is yours? What can you do every day that is yours? And that can be things like doing the daily bath time. It can be doing baby massage. I'll talk a little bit more about that. It can be reading your baby a story. You can read a newborn baby a story. It's very powerful, whatever it might be. Baby massage in particular from our research is very powerful in preventing postnatal depression. We know men who do baby massage are much less likely to suffer. And it also increases bonds between baby and father because it's a releaser of bonding hormones for dad and baby. So if you can get yourself some knowledge of baby massage, some really good YouTube videos, then that's something that's good to encourage a new father to do. So again, we need to work to identify it. Unfortunately, it's still quite hard to get instruments that are suitable for fathers, what tends to happen is they are given the Edinburgh Depression Scale, which is actually for mothers, and it's just laid on top and they go, just fill that in. And obviously it's completely inappropriate because it's a different set of symptoms. So we need to identify it. We need peer support, okay? So encouraging fathers to talk to other fathers is very powerful, and self-care. So the idea of looking after yourself. You do not have to be the rock all the time. That is not actually helpful in the long run to anybody. It's not helpful to you, and it's not helpful to your family, because when that rock crumbles, the backwash from that can be quite powerful. So it's very important to acknowledge that you also need help. So after all that, a bit of biology, a bit of psychology, what does dad actually do? So we've talked about building a role, transitioning, but the really big thing that we have found about fathers is that regardless of your culture, and I've studied fathers in Kenya, in Thailand, in Congo, in the middle of nowhere, regardless of culture, they all have exactly the same basic role. And that is to scaffold their child's entry into the world beyond the family. They are the parent who, after a bit of time says, okay, here's the world. I'm going to help you go into it. I'm going to give you those skills. And I'm going to be here if you get scared and want to run back, but I'm also here to give you the resilience. And everything we look at in terms of fathers' behaviour and in terms of what they underpin in terms of development, it's all linked to that role. So they are the primary influence on behavioural and cognitive development in the social sphere. So they are the ones that underpin the likelihood that a child, for example, will have good pro-social skills. So they'll be good at helping, caring, sharing. That they will have appropriate emotional regulation skills, that they will have appropriate social language, that they will know about reciprocity. This is all linked to what dad does with a child. And we know from a cognitive point of view, they are the ones that underpin the development of all those skills within the brain. So the roles of mums and dads have evolved to be different. We know that. We've seen the peak activations in the brain. And those roles don't mirror each other, they complement each other. So that the child gets the entire 360 developmental environment. And it's really important to encourage fathers to be fathers. I sometimes speak to mums and I say, and I did this, before I did any of this study, I did this, you're leaving the baby with the dad to do something and you leave a minute list of everything that has to be happened and this is how we do it and this is how don't do that, okay? Some very brief instructions because dads do things differently and they are supposed to. That is the point. So let them be who they are. Dad's role is very much based on stimulation. Mum's role is based on nurture. Okay, so whenever you see a father interacting with a child, it's generally more stimulatory than it is when a mother does. And that's important. That stimulation is a key part of how they build their attachment to the child, but also how they underpin this development of the brain. Obviously, fathers' roles evolve during their child's lifetime. You're not going to be doing the same things with your toddler as you are with your teenager. But regardless of when you look at across the child's lifespan, it's always still based upon challenge, stimulation, and support. So pushing the boundaries. It always makes me laugh when I go and see new fathers around sort of when their baby's about 3 or 4 months. They're already there going, they know exactly when all the dates are as to when the child's supposed to do something, and they're trying to beat the date. So the child, you're supposed to sit up at 8 months, but my child sat up at 6 months. So, they're there always pushing, challenge, stimulate. And that's a really important part of their job. How do they build their bonds? So dads do have an attachment relationship with their baby. Even John Bowlby, the absolute god of attachment, didn't think they did, which is awful, 1950s. Dads do, even when I started researching, a couple of decades ago, and even then it was believed that fathers didn't have attachments. It was just mums. Of course they do. Just to tell you quickly what attachment relationships are, they are incredibly profound. They are developmentally significant, particularly for children, particularly in the first 2 years of life. So that is the attachment environment is the environment of development, essentially. They're based on the concept of a secure base. So hopefully you have a secure attachment with your child. That child can use that security as a fount of confidence to leave the relationship and go out and be confident as an individual with autonomy in the space. Based on the need for proximity, so attachment relationships are about remaining physically close. They provide emotional regulation, particularly in children. So attachment relationships are the basis for emotional regulation. And we all know this, they can lead to separation distress when apart. I want to tell you a little bit very briefly about biobehavioural synchrony, because biobehavioural synchrony is the basis of attachment. And some of you might have heard me talk about this before, but what's wonderful is we see it in fathers with their children. And really biobehavioral synchrony is, in a way, the biological definition of love, I suppose. So we all know when people are closely bonded to each other, they mirror each other's behaviour. That's something we've probably all seen. If we look inside the body of those two people who are in love, we see a synchrony of physiology. So their heart rate, their body temperature, their blood pressure are also in synchrony. And then if we look in the brain, we see synchrony in brain activations. So the same areas of the brain are activated to the same intensity, which means they basically view the world as one. And the neurochemical levels in particular which underpin bonding, such as oxytocin, also come into synchrony. We all exist at different baseline levels of oxytocin. All of your levels will be different here, but when you interact with someone you love, they come into synchrony, they become the same. And we know this because, lovely little experiment, not done by us, but if you squirt a dad up the nose with oxytocin, which is always fun, and then you get them to interact with their child, having taken the child's baseline level of oxytocin, that child's oxytocin level will rise to the artificially increased level of the father. Biobehavioral synchrony is important because what it actually is that it's two organisms or two people coming together becoming one. They are actually the same operating system because their behaviour, their physiology and their brain are operating as one. And that is basically the biological definition of soulmates, actually. But it's what happens between a father and child when they interact, which is absolutely astonishing. So how do you build your bond to the baby? Prenatal bonding is really, really, really important. And I bang on about this a lot because I think when fathers are involved in pregnancy, it can feel quite distant. Obviously, mum's building this profound, very physical bond to her baby. It can be harder for fathers. So we have to try and help fathers do that prenatally. We know that if you bond prenatally, it's predictive of postnatal bonding. You're more likely to build a secure bond following birth. So if we can get some prenatal bonding in, that's good. Interactions are important. It's a beautiful study that's just come out about antenatal scans. So they did a trial and they taught the people who did the scans to help interpret what the baby was doing on the screen and get the father to interact with the baby during the scan, and then taught the father through the response of the baby. So they would say things like, if you put your hand here, that's where the baby's foot is, can you press it? Oh look, the baby pushed back at you. And what they have found is that is incredibly powerful in terms of building bonds for fathers and starting them to really start this prenatal bonding and in fact the transition to fatherhood before birth. So, if we could spread that to all antenatal scans, even for 2 minutes, get the scanner to actually help the father interpret the reaction of the baby, then that's a very powerful tool. We know that fathers who daydream about their babies, what's my baby going to be like, what are we going to do together, what kind of dad am I going to be, that helps. We know that the emotional response is predictive. So if as a father you have a positive emotional response to becoming a father, that increases the prenatal bond. And we also know, as I've said, it's predictive of postnatals. Postnatally, one thing we have to prepare fathers for is there can be a delay in bonding. Because fathers build their bonds through interaction, they don't get the head start of pregnancy, quite often there is a considerable delay in developing the sort of bonds they imagined they would have. So the tidal wave of love occurs for some parents, mums and dads, but for some it doesn't, and particularly for fathers, there might be a considerable delay. All my fathers say that their bond with their baby at 6 months is profoundly different to the one they had when their baby was born. And quite a lot of them will worry that they don't have this feeling and that makes them a bad father, or their baby doesn't like them. So it's something actually we have to handle the expectation of. That doesn't make you a bad father. It is perfectly normal to maybe consciously think I have a bond to this baby because we're genetically related and but to actually not feel it. And not feel it for quite a long time. And that's because you have to interact with your baby. And newborn babies are not good at interacting. Okay? Takes time. Once baby starts to, smile, babble, respond to you, and particularly at 6 months when we can start a bit of rough and tumble play, then you will accelerate and it will feel much better. But do not blame yourself. It is entirely biological as to why you're having the problem. Just wanted to mention that dads and babies are preferred play partners. We've all heard of rough and tumble play, I'm sure. It's incredibly important behaviour in fathers. It is obviously very exuberant, very little bit risky, very noisy, very physical, lots of giggling, lots of throwing in the air, all that kind of stuff. And what's wonderful is, first of all, play is developmentally absolutely vital. But secondly, fathers and children have co-evolved to gravitate to each other to play. So we talked about peak activation in the brain. There are also different peaks in oxytocin between mums and dads in terms of what behaviours with their babies produce the peak in oxytocin. For mums, it's nurturing. They get a peak in oxytocin from nurturing. They will get a peak in not a peak, but a release of oxytocin in play, but it's not as high. With fathers, that peak in oxytocin occurs with play. Less of a release when they're nurturing. So fathers naturally want to play because they get this lovely feeling from playing. And children also, when they're interacting with their father, the peak they get is with play. So they've co-evolved to seek each other out and to get that wonderful peak in oxytocin from each other. And that is why generally, if children want to have a really sort of mad, play bout, they will generally go and find their dad to do that rather than go to their mum. Very briefly, dad's role in child development. So building baby. So we all know, and I'm sure we all know this, that the relationship between a baby and its carers is foundational. It is the foundational relationship of life. Because a baby's brain is developing very quickly post-birth for the first 2 years, particularly the prefrontal cortical areas, which is where your social cognition is, and areas related to the amygdala, how that baby experiences their environment during those first 2 years is critical to the brain they build and their ability to go on and have functional relationships when they're older. So it's absolutely foundational. We know from several studies, for a start, that parental sensitivity during play in the first 3 years of life has a direct relationship to the child's brain density. So the more sensitive the play, the more child-led the play, the greater that child's brain density in terms of grey and white matter, and that means they have a functionally well-connected brain, they have a healthy brain to go forward. Children who, unfortunately, at the very extreme other end, who are neglected, if we look at their brains on the scanner screen, it's very clear there's been a lot of neuronal pruning, and unfortunately there are some quite empty areas of the brain simply because they have not had that sensitive interaction, which is the foundation to the building of the brain. We also know that parental brain density is predictive of preschool adaptation. So looking at parents' brains in areas related to 3 areas: in the limbic area, in the empathetic areas, and in an area known as the mentalizing area, which is to do with understanding people's intentions, very important for social interaction. The greater the parental brain density, which obviously then links to their behaviour, the better a child will transfer into preschool. Dads also have a positive impact on birth outcomes for mums and babies. We know fathers who attend birth, we have much better health outcomes for both mum and baby. And this is particularly striking in ethnic minority families. So in ethnic minority families where, unfortunately, mums have less positive outcomes from birth anyway, if we can have the father present as well, that decreases the risks associated with that birth, mainly because fathers can also step in and advocate for their partner. Building a child, I'm going to focus particularly on the power of play. So play is resilience building. So it's not only great for building bonds because it releases lots of oxytocin and dopamine, particularly rough and tumble play, but it's incredibly important for confronting challenge and risk. If you think how physical rough and tumble play is, it can be a little bit dangerous. It can cause people to go, it's incredibly important in teaching the child about there is challenge in the world, there is risk in the world. You have to be able to assess what is an appropriate level of risk, and you have to stand up to challenge. You have to pick yourself up, dust yourself off and carry on. It's incredibly important for mental and physical resilience building. And because fathers are the key parent for doing this, they are the ones that underpin resilience building in their children. It also teaches social skills of reciprocity. Play has to be two-way. It's no fun if you're literally just constantly hurling someone across a room and they're giving nothing back. That's more, violence, really. That's not play. So you have to learn that it's give and take. Social word is give and take. And you have to learn empathy because you have to read whether what you're doing to the other person is still fun. Okay? You have to understand what their emotional reaction is, what their face is telling you. And so play is very important for building empathetic abilities. And the issue of play is not the quantity, it's not the 2-hour bout, it's the quality of play is important. And that means it has to be child-led. Okay, it has to be not your idea as a dad of what a good play bout is, but what is your child's idea of what is a good play bout. And if rough and tumble play is not your thing, that is absolutely fine. There are many forms of play. There's creative play, there's imaginative play, there's object play. When they get a bit older, there's gaming. Any of these things are play, and they're something that a father can take part in. And finally, building a teenager. And this is really, for me, one of the really big times, apart from preschool, when a father really does underpin the skills a child needs to go into preschool, is when a teenager becomes a teenager, because the primary attachment does shift from parents to peers. You're no longer the centre of their world. Certainly not when it comes to attachment, but it's still very, very key. And it's key particularly for fathers, because dad is the parent when it comes to scaffolding his teenager's mental health and resilience. Because fathers are the key parent when it comes to social skills and operating in the social world, and because a lot of the mental health issues that teenagers experience come from the social realm, it is dad actually, and the relationship he has with his children, which is more predictive of his child's mental health than mum. And because he is the parent of mental resilience, particularly when that offspring is a child, he is the one who has taught mental resilience. So fathers who have secure attachments to their children, fathers who have sensitive play with their children, fathers who have been involved with their children, those children are much less likely to suffer from poor mental health as teenagers and young adults. So teenagers with a secure attachment to dad have a low risk of depression, eating disorders, anxiety, low self-esteem and self-harm. And in a world where we have a teenage mental health crisis, this is a completely untapped font of support, actually. And I think it's the next frontier, is actually promoting dads as the parent to support teenagers. Again, it still remains stimulating, any interaction you have with your child, but tends to be one-to-one activities, and they have to be led by the teenagers. So it's about you not imposing your ideas about what's fun on your teenager, but what your teenager finds fun moving into their world. And we know that acceptance of teenagers is really important. Accept who your teenager is. Support who your teenager is. That leads to self-acceptance. It reduces negative internalising and externalising behaviours. And it allows them to understand effective regulation of emotion and behaviour. So dads really are, in a way, the superheroes of mental health in the teenage years. We're just not promoting them in that way, and it's something that we really, really need to do. So I think the message that comes from child development is that there are two key times in a child's life when dads are particularly important, and that is whenever they move away from the family. So preschool is the first time they move away from the family into society, and that's why it is dad's relationship with that child which is more predictive of how well they enter preschool. And again, in the teenage years, when the child is moving further away from the family, becoming autonomous and shifting their attachments. Oh yeah, and sorry, biobehavioural synchrony in teenagers is very important for stress regulation. So it's about having those one-to-one moments where you can encourage biobehavioural synchrony, and that's very important for handling stress. So, just a quick summary. Dads are as biologically and psychologically primed to parent as mums are. Dads undergo a transition period which can last up to 2 years, depending upon how competent they feel. 10% of men experience perinatal depression. And also, by the way, 8% of dads who experience traumatic birth have diagnosable PTSD. The relationships between the father and child is an attachment based on nurture and stimulation, which is categorically different to that between the mother and the child, which is based on nurture. All fathers, regardless of culture, scaffold their child's entry into the world beyond the family, which means they are the parent when it comes to social development. Fathers are the key parent when it comes to the development of social, cognitive and behavioural skills within the social sphere. They are particularly critical during the preschool and teenage years. And you've all got a copy of that book, so I won't flog that. But that's my website, where there's lots of articles and podcasts and all that kind of thing. And that's my Instagram and Twitter handle if you want to follow the work that I do. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'm sorry that was really like a bit of a barreling quick through it. But yay, thank you very much.